a detransitioner who underwent a double mastectomy and now lives with physical health issues from that surgery, brings a timely message to our podcast about how mental and physical health are connected. Instead of pursuing risky, experimental, and life-altering treatments for gender dysphoria, she will share with us the need for a medical protocol grounded in the physical fundamentals of health. Plus, there are some developments with the Minnesota Human Rights Act, a bill that, if passed into law, would gut religious freedom in Minnesota. I'm Grace Lawrence with a Family Beacon podcast, and it is great to be back with you all. It has been a very, very busy week at Minnesota Family Council and at True North Legal. And last week, Moses was on the podcast with Renee Carlson of True North Legal, and I'm joined with her again, and I'm very excited to have her here. She's going to update us again on the Minnesota Human Rights Act and what that really means for us. So, Renee, thanks so much for joining us.
Grace, it's good to be here with you today. Glad to be back. It has been quite a busy week. As you mentioned, I was here with Moses just last week, actually, just last Thursday, talking about the Minnesota Human Rights Act and our fight to protect religious freedom in Minnesota for all people of faith in Minnesota. So last week, we didn't know the status of the bill. And just as a reminder, the Minnesota Human Rights Act at this point does not include protections for religious organizations. That means schools, churches, mosques, synagogues. Essentially, the legislature has moved those protections in the Department of Human Rights' current bill. So we have been working hard to make clear that that is unconstitutional and that those protections need to be restored. So we have been waiting, wondering, when is this bill going to come up? And we found out on Sunday, Grace, around 3 p.m. that the bill was coming up on Monday at 3 p.m. So everything had to be in, and then, actually everything needed to be in by 3 p.m. And then at 6:15, they were going to have a hearing. That hearing ended up including about 15 or so additional bills. So we ended up waiting about almost 7 hours to testify. I was there, the Catholic Conference was there, LCMS was there, and also the Islamic Association of North America was there. We waited and testified around 12:30 a.m. to the unconstitutional, brazen removal of the exemptions for religious organizations in the Minnesota Human Rights Act. Senator Limmer introduced an amendment to, again, restore the protections for religious organizations in this bill. And the department's response, as well as the bill author, was that this is just a technical bill. And so, Grace, what she meant by that is that we're not dealing with those things right now. We're just doing little cleanups. We're not dealing with that specific policy issue. We're not taking that on. And we found that to be astounding and honestly really disturbing. So unfortunately, the amendment did not get adopted. The bill without the amendment was passed with a 5-3 vote. It was passed on party lines. And the other thing I wanted to share here, because of course, while you were all sleeping, the Minnesota legislature was removing your protections for religious freedom. I said, it was a long hearing and there's a lot to watch. So I want to just give you a few highlights. As I said, this bill was regarded as a technical bill. So there is a complete disregard for speaking about a policy issue that can be addressed in a bill that is speaking to the Minnesota Department of Human Rights regulations. There's no reason why they couldn't take that on. Another thing that happened is the chairman, Senator Letts, before we testified, said, I want to wrap this up in 20 minutes. I mean, Grace, this is such a consequential bill. So here we are at 12:30 a.m. and we're talking about removing our protections for religious liberty in violation
Everyone else is sleeping.
Everyone else is
You're
sleeping.
there on the front lines.
And then they want to wrap this up in 20 minutes. No robust debate.
Wow.
No transparency. Very little notice. This is really unacceptable. We need to allow Minnesotans to participate, to have a very robust discussion about the removal of these very significant protections.
So Renee, I find that really interesting on so many levels, and thank you so much for being there so early in the morning and waiting there for 7 hours. Wow. But you mentioned that there are other faith committees really stepping up here. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, Grace, as I said, this affects all faith communities. So we had Sheikh Yusuf Abdullah who came and he testified and he talked about the significance of men, women, and marriage and human sexuality and how that impacts the Muslim faith. We had Fred Hinz from the LCMS who testified about religious autonomy and the importance of churches being able to make decisions about who they decide ministers will be within their churches. And that is very significant. We also had Jason Atkins, who was there from the Catholic Conference, who gave some zingers in his testimony. I would invite everybody to go watch it. I mean, he made the point clear, really, it is absolutely unconstitutional to pass this bill without the religious exemption. I touched on some very specific points in the law. The Supreme Court has made very clear in the Hosanna Tabor decision, as well as Our Lady of Guadalupe, that, and I'll give you the quote here, that churches and other religious institutions have the right to decide matters of faith and doctrine without government intrusion. We are simply asking to be left alone, to follow our conscience, to operate our religious organizations without government interference. If this bill does not include the religious exemption, the government is telling us that their religion dictates, that they get to tell us what we are to believe, who we are to hire, how we're supposed to observe and respect the tenets of our faith. Grace, I can't say it enough, it is absolutely unconstitutional. And if any churches or religious organizations have questions about what this means moving forward, feel free to contact us at info@truenorthlegal.org. We're happy to walk through and talk through this with you. And I just ask that you would all be praying that this religious exemption would be included in the larger omnibus bill that this policy will probably be part of in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much, Renee. I'm so glad that you here as a legal expert are able to come on the podcast and brief our audience on what is happening. It's so important to inform people because, again, the legislators are trying to push this while Minnesotans are asleep. Renee's testimony that she gave so early in the morning is so powerful, you guys. So I'm going to link that in our show notes so you can check out her full testimony. But Renee, is there any other closing remark that you'd like to make before we move on to our interview with the detransitioner I mentioned?
I would just encourage all of our listeners to continue to stand. We are on the right side of history with this. We are never losing by standing for the truth, and we are never losing by standing up for our faith and what the Lord has called us to do here.
Renee, you're on fire. So blessed to work with you. So blessed to have you on the podcast.
Grace.
We will all be praying. We're standing with you. And for our podcast listeners, we will keep you updated on what happens. We absolutely will.
Absolutely.
So make sure you tune into our podcast. We'll be having Renee back on as makes sense. And of course, we'll update you on our email list. So without further ado, let's go over to our interview. We're going to be having Becca Delahunt, who is our Director of Public Policy, interview that detransitioner I mentioned. Now, this conversation is super powerful. You will not want to miss it.
Hi, everyone. I'm Becca Delahunt, Director of Public Policy with Minnesota Family Council. Thank you for joining us today. I am joined with Camille Kiefel today, who testified in a Senate hearing regarding detransitioners and healthcare. Camille is a detransitioner. She's from Oregon, and she came out here to testify on this bill. And so I would love for you to hear her story and also for her to share her concerns from the hearing this morning and also maybe address some things that were not discussed that should be on the record. And so, Camille, thanks so much for joining us. We're so happy to have you here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, can you tell our viewers, our listeners, a little bit about your story?
Yes, so I'm a detransitioner, and for years I've been struggling with trauma. And around 6th grade, my dad was trying to look out for me and was concerned for me. And so he was telling me about how men his age talk sexually about girls my age. And he was just worried that like I wasn't going to dress conservatively enough. And around the same time, my best friend had been raped by her brother. And it felt like my body was running on a voltage higher than it should have been. Mm-hmm. And I was just really struggling. I started to dress more masculine. So I was starting to hide my curves. I was wearing baggy shirts to hide my breasts. And in college, I was introduced to the idea of being non-binary. And this was appealing to me because it was almost like opting out of gender and being able to protect myself. And so I was just, in general, I was also just struggling with a lot of mental health issues. In 2016, I saw a gender affirming therapist, and she affirmed my non-binary gender identity. And then after about 20 years of struggling with mental health. I'd been seeing mental health professionals that entire time. In 2020, at that point, I'd seen about therapists for 20 years, and
Can I interrupt you? Was that mental health therapist then? You've been seeing them
Yes.
since childhood?
Yes, I'd been seeing mental health therapists since childhood. So yes, so I had been seeing mental health professionals for about 20 years. I'd done 2 rounds of TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation therapy, which is reserved for treatment-resistant depression. I had, I didn't respond well to medications for both my ADHD and my depression. And so at that point, I reached out to my doctor and I asked about gender-affirming care, particularly top surgery. And I was like, I don't know. I'm non-binary. I don't even know if this can be covered. And they looked into it. I think I got my first letter in like June, and then I got my second letter in July, and then I got the surgery August 27th, 2020. So within months, the surgery was approved and I had it.
That's significant, because we're generally told it's so hard to get these letters of recommendation or surgeries, but that wasn't your case. It went really quickly.
It went really quickly. Okay. And so I was really struggling, and I thought this might be an answer, because too, I had discomfort with my breast. I was like, I thought I was non-binary for years. And then after the surgery, I developed all these health issues. So I was struggling with those, and my doctor took me seriously at first until they thought I had psychosomatic fever. Then they stopped taking me seriously. So at that point, I was like, I either need to end my life or figure out what to do, because like, I can't live like this. Like, nobody's meant to live this way. Yeah. And so I started addressing my physical health, because I knew the issue lied with my physical health. And I was shocked when I started addressing my physical health and my mental health finally improved. Like, it was what I needed all along. And doctors weren't taking it seriously, because for conventional medicine, a lot of the times they see somebody struggling with mental illness and they want to give you an antidepressant. Like, they don't want to look into underlying health issues like low thyroid or even autoimmune issues, which can cause issues like depression. So,
So you managed your own healthcare, basically. And you said, okay, I'm going to try to address this, and I'm going to change my own diet. You didn't have the help of a healthcare provider in that instance to help you detransition. You helped yourself detransition.
I did. Yeah. So it was after I started addressing my physical health, and I was changing diet. Like, I saw Michaela Peterson. I'm like, wow, she's really stable on this carnivore diet. And I didn't go on full carnivore, but I added meat back into my diet. Yeah. And then I started feeling better. Yeah. And then I was doing manual therapy, and I was starting to connect more with my body. And then I was doing hyperbaric oxygen therapy, which is a treatment where you receive pure oxygen in a pressurized environment. My generalized anxiety disorder went away. My ADHD significantly improved. It was like a 60-day treatment, or 60-day treatment. And I was documenting it every day, and I went from like 72 points to 6. Wow. So significant improvement on my ADHD. And it was like, okay, there is actually a physical component to mental health that our medical system has become so transhumanist and so disconnected from like the body and the mind that when somebody's dealing with an underlying health issue, and they're struggling also with mental health, like that underlying health issue just gets ignored.
Yes. Yes, that's a concern. That's a huge concern. Well, I'm so glad that you were able to get some help after that, and that you also were able to find some of these solutions on your own. That's pretty significant. And that actually ties into the hearing today. I did want to ask you about the hearing today. And as I get into this, I want to share with our listeners, we're so thankful and happy to have Camille here and partner on this. You might pick up, we have some differences maybe in the way that we look at some of these things, but we're so thankful to be able to partner with her to ensure that detransitioners get healthcare and also protect children from gender ideology. And so today, there was another hearing on a bill that would force all insurers who are operating in Minnesota to cover so-called gender-affirming care. And there are many concerns with that. There's no age limits in the bill as is, but also there's no explicit protections for detransitioners. And we know that detransitioners aren't getting care. This is not just Camille's experience. This is the broader experience of detransitioners. So I did want to ask Camille a question that you had wanted to be asked and weren't able to, was what does detransitioner healthcare look like for the people that you know? And maybe you can also talk about your organization, Detrans Help too, and how you're trying to help detransitioners.
Yeah, I can do that. So detransitioner care is complicated because it's almost like multifaceted, because we're seeing a lot of homelessness, we're seeing low income like Medicaid. So we're seeing that. So something like vocational services could be really beneficial to detransitioners. Some detransitioners struggle with drug issues. So, dealing with that addiction would be another thing to address. I think the medical care is a huge one that's not being addressed. Like, we do see services like GenSpect providing therapy, but nobody's really doing the conventional medicine. And there is, I think, too, an ethics around further medicalizing detransitioners. And that's something we need to be really cautious around. But this is something I've been advocating for because, I've heard so many stories around detransitioners. There's one who was working on our website originally for Detrans Help, and she was not able to complete the website because her fingers hurt so much from nerve pain.
Wow.
And so she's not able to function because of the complications from her surgery or HRT.
Yeah.
And so, or both.
Yeah.
And that's a difficulty too, is that we just don't know what is exactly causing things like nerve pain. And we just know that this is a common, unexpected thing that we're seeing with detransitioners.
Correct. HRT, that's hormone replacement therapy. I will note, and people who work in healthcare will know this, sex hormones don't just affect your sexuality, they affect so much of your development, right? They affect your bone health, your heart health, maybe your nerve health. I haven't looked into that, but it just affects so many different aspects of your body. Can you address something that you touched on in your testimony, was how the WHO and WPATH does not have ICD10 health codes, or maybe that was WHO does not have ICD10 codes. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I can talk about that. So the WHO, or the World Health Organization, does not have an ICD-10 code for detransition. So they do have these ICD-10 codes for transition and gender variance. And why ICD-10 codes are important is because your provider will use those in order to provide medical care for like billing insurance. So
that's fitting for the hearing today.
It is fitting for the hearing, yes, because the hearing was about medical care for insurance. And so the problem with ICD-10 codes is that when you bill a detransitioner under something like gender variance, it doesn't actually match the experience with detransitioners. So there's a couple issues with this. And one of that is that medically we will be documented as another gender affirming care case. So the fact is that detransitioners are actually going to be erased medically from the records. And then the other issue, the main issue is just that definition doesn't match it. So gender variance is the idea that your birth sex doesn't align with the sex you identify with. Well, detransitioners, their birth sex and their the sex they identify with align. And so that's not the actual definition and therefore medical fraud. So that's a very important thing to understand, and was concerning that they weren't addressing that during the hearing.
Yes.
And you touched on that, right? Don't you have a personal story about it being coded as medical fraud for you to get detransition care?
Yeah, so there was one detransitioner I know of that had his breast implants removed, and they billed it under a different medical code than what the procedure was. And so that would have been medical fraud.
Wow, that's incredible. And you also said it took him 2 years?
It took him 2 years, probably because he was having difficulty even getting that care, because it does make it difficult when you don't have a billing code for detransition. Like, I know for myself personally, I've looked into reconstruction surgery. And one of the first things they said to me was, well, I don't think we can cover it because you're cisgender. And so there's it's so insensitive to what I've gone through, to the trauma I've been through. It's just shocking how callous they treat you once you detransition. And it's, like even not even acknowledging like what I had been through and like how
Yes.
difficult this is. It's just, well, you're cisgender, so I don't think we can cover it.
So you're fine.
You're
so
fine.
you're going to have to
Yeah.
deal with it. That
Yeah.
is just unacceptable. And we want that
Yeah.
to be covered.
Mhm.
I felt like a lot of the comments made today were incredibly insensitive to you and other detransitioners. Would you like to comment on that today? There was some good discussion, and there was a senator who was advocating for you to be able to have access to healthcare. But I also was pretty shocked at some of the comments that were made in your presence about how Camille, trying to advocate for this, they didn't use her name specifically, but advocating for detransitioners to be covered on this is dismissive of the fact that trans people exist. It was something along those lines.
Yeah, and it was pretty surreal because in my testimony I said, that providing care for detransitioners does not subtract from the care that would be established for trans individuals. Like I was very clear on that, and I even said in the testimony, no one should be forced to live as the sex that they don't identify with. And it was just weird to be I'm trying to look at this from all perspectives and being considerate of others. Yeah. And it's sad how dismissive they are of detransitioners and how, there's so much we don't know. Even like WPATH openly acknowledges that they know very little about detransition. Like they openly know that, and their reasons for detransition is transphobia and maybe some misdiagnosis. But you have to know who's not a good candidate for a procedure to know who's a good candidate for a procedure. Like that just needs to happen. And it's like difficult when you're trying to work with the other side and then they're just being incredibly dismissive, or they just blow you off as somebody who's conservative. And it's bothersome because it's not actually looking at the facts of the situation.
You are not making it political.
I'm not making it political. Yeah. Detrans Help is a nonpartisan organization. Like we are working to be as neutral as possible because we think that that's important. And it's sad to see how, it's kind of surreal to see how dismissive, like, and two, like this idea that, there's this idea that, there's this idea that trans people like deserve medical care even though they're a small population. And then when detransitioners, who are an even smaller population, come forward and saying we need medical care too, that we're dismissed and we're denied medical care.
Yes.
So it's just, there's a double standard there as well.
Correct. Yep. Yeah. When the quote unquote gender affirming care is only set up to help people transition, they don't know how to help people detransition. And so they are excluding you. They are, even though they say it's covered, the providers don't know how to cover it. So just the fact that you're stating that on the record doesn't mean that it's actually happening, because it's not.
Yeah. And they're also not, there's a different way. And that's what I addressed in my testimony. Like detransitioners want to be treated a different way from trans individuals. Like we don't want to be told that our detransition was a part of our gender journey. Yeah. That's incredibly insensitive. Yes. And we want to be treated a certain way. Like we want to be treated well. And it's sad that, that they don't want to have that discussion that, detransitioner care looks very different from trans care. Like, let's have that discussion and let's actually, provide better care and figure out what's the way we can provide the best care possible.
One comment I should make, it was stated by the House proponent in a House committee hearing a few weeks ago that the trans community takes good care of the detransitioner community. And I thought nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, then they disregard this amendment that would have protected your health. Before we go, I did want to touch on a question that you had wanted to talk about in the hearing, which was detransitioner demographics. And then unfortunately, I think we're going to have to close out the interview. But can you talk about the people who are seeking care and what you would like our viewers to know about them, how they can care for them? Maybe we have some medical providers here, and maybe we just have people who want to be a friend. What would you advise? But first, starting out with, who are these detransitioners? Can you share that?
So we're seeing in the detransitioner population, like a lot of mental health comorbidities and mental disabilities. So we're seeing autism, ADHD, particularly with those populations, like there can be a lot of black and white thinking. And so like, instead of being like, well, there's some flexibility in like gender expression sort of thing. Like, you know, like this is a boy thing, this is a girl thing. So that sort of black and white thinking of like can potentially lead them down to transition versus like there's flexibility and like it's okay to be a girl and like to work with computers or, you know, or electronics. So that sort of inflexibility around the idea of gender can lead to that sort of questioning. There's a lot of gay individuals and lesbians who who have like internalized homophobia, and so then they want to transition and they're seeking transition because of that. Yeah, so pretty much what we're seeing in the population is that there's a lot of mental health comorbidities, disabilities, internalized homophobia. We're seeing individuals struggling with trauma, many times girls struggling with sexual trauma, and so this wanting to protect yourself can be very appealing. And it almost becomes like really survival mechanism. So yeah, it's really concerning because we're seeing this population. So we reached out to WPATH. We said we do have concerns around this. Like in particular, we talked about internalized homophobia and we said we want to have a discussion. And we never heard a response. Same thing with the WHO. We were like, okay, talk about the ICD10 codes. There's no detransitioners on your board. We have concerns. Can we talk about this? And neither of those organizations reached out. And like I said in the testimony, like this is important because these are organizations that hold a lot of power. And we just want to start a dialogue. We want to say, okay, we're seeing these patterns. Like, let's try and work through this and try and like figure out how to provide better care.
Absolutely. They're the leaders. They should be the health leaders on this. What would you say, just in closing, to our listeners who care, they want to, you know, extend love and care, and maybe any medical providers who are listening, what would you say to them in closing?
Yeah. So I guess like partially just Detrans Help is providing resources to detransitioners and those who care about us. We are hoping to do a case study on some low-risk treatments, non-invasive treatments, because I think that's going to be a big thing in the next couple of years, is finding things that actually help detransitioners, and getting these case studies published in medical journals will allow this to be covered by insurance, which is huge.
Awesome.
Yeah, and we are always looking for those who have like a more holistic approach or integrative approach. We are very concerned about further medicalizing detransitioners. So we'd love to work with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here today, Camille, and for sharing your story. I'm so glad that we could have a little bit more of an extended time. 2 minutes for testimony is nothing. So we could have a little more to share your story and answer some of the questions that didn't really get answered. So thank you so much for tuning in to the Family Beacon podcast. Grace and Moses will be back here next week.